Hi there, and welcome to At the Helm. In today's episode, Dr. Charles Helm sits down with Dr. David Unwin, a GP from Southport, United Kingdom, who has helped to revolutionize the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Known as the Low-Carb GP, Dr. Unwin shares how he turned career burnout into a groundbreaking mission to help his patients achieve type 2 diabetes remission through food and lifestyle changes rather than solely relying on medication. He shares his inspiring journey, the GRIN behavior change model, and simple tips for busy family doctors wanting to make larger impacts in shorter amounts of time. They will also go into why this approach is sometimes met with resistance, but how it is changing healthcare for the better. Be sure to follow the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition on social media and check out their many resources like the Reversing Prediabetes site, the Diabetes Remission site, and the TCR Type 1 Diabetes Guide. And follow At the Helm wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to At the Helm, the health podcast where we explore food as medicine and food as treatment for chronic disease. I'm your host, Dr. Charles Helm. I'm a family doctor who for more than 30 years has worked in the remote rural community of Tumbler Ridge in northern British Columbia. I'm also a paleontologist with a PhD from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. I'm very privileged to be hosting this podcast in Tumbler Ridge from the traditional territory of the Treaty 8 First Nations in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Now, At the Helm is sponsored by IPTN, the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. And in today's podcast, I will be welcoming Dr. David Unwin. Dr. Unwin is a pioneering British general practitioner, GP, what in British Columbia we call a family physician or a family doc, and he's gained international recognition for his innovative approach to treating type 2 diabetes. He has been in the Norwood surgery in Southport in England, the UK, which is near Liverpool, I believe, and he has transformed countless lives. He's challenged conventional medical wisdom with his groundbreaking work, so much so that in 2016 he received the NHS, the National Health Service, Innovator of the Year Award for his research into lifestyle changes in type 2 diabetes. And remarkably, his GP practice spends £40,000 per year less than expected on medications for type 2 diabetes. Dr. Unwin is particularly interested in the low carbohydrate diet as an alternative to lifelong medication in type 2 diabetes, but in addition, he's researched and published on other things, how a low-carb diet can positively affect liver function, kidney function, blood pressure. He's been featured all over the place, on the BBC, The Independent, The Times. He's presented his work to the UK Treasury and to the House of Lords. For 3 decades, Dr. Unwin practiced conventional medicine, and then something happened that dramatically changed his approach to medicine and his personal satisfaction. So I'm going to try and explore that quite a bit in this podcast. But before I introduce Dr. Unwin to you, just a quick disclaimer. The information provided today in this podcast by me or by Dr. Unwin is for educational purposes only, and it's not providing direct medical advice. In other words, listening to this podcast does not constitute a doctor-patient relationship. And for some listeners who might be on prescription medications for type 2 diabetes or other conditions, making major changes in your diet can, in combination with these medications, can potentially lead to side effects, which sometimes can be serious. So if you're on prescription medications, our recommendation is just to chat with your healthcare provider before making major dietary changes. And now, it is my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to David Unwin. Dr. Unwin, David, you are so welcome. Thank you for making time for us. Thank you for joining us all the way from England.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you and your audience, which I believe is mainly in Canada. So I'm many thousands of miles away. As you said already, I'm I live on a farm by the sea, actually, by a marsh. So as I look out through the window here, the sun is about to set, as it probably is rising or has risen with you. And I live by a nature reserve, a marsh, and we can see miles and miles and miles. So it's a sort of, I live by a marsh, although my practice, as you rightly said, is just about 5 miles away on the way to Liverpool. So people will have heard of Liverpool. That's where I'm near.
When I think of Liverpool, I think of the Beatles and I think of soccer, or I'm not sure, do you call that football? I'm not sure, but maybe you are Liverpool's most famous icon or resident. I'm not sure about that. More so than the Beatles.
Well, that's hilarious and very, very kind of you. I think the Beatles are somewhere ahead of me, and many of the footballers are they're very, very famous. But anyway, certainly in the world of low-carb diabetes, I'm
Yes,
quite
that's
well
right.
known.
Right. So what I'd just like to start off with is understanding your trajectory. I'm a family physician myself, but understanding your trajectory, how you got to where you did, and especially, I think many of us as family docs have at times felt that disillusion. We were very idealistic when we got into medicine, hoping to do a lot of good and change patients' lives for the better. And then sometimes disillusionment sets in. And I'm not sure if you had a moment of epiphany or if it was a slower process, but something happened in 2012 to you, I believe, and it changed your life, I think, for the better and the lives of your patients.
Thank you. Yes. Well, there was a slow bit and a fast bit. I always thought I might be better as a larger fish in a small pond, and that's why I came to Southport. It's a small town. I felt I would stand a better chance of making a difference in family medicine if I had a settled population and if it was in a small town. And that's why I came to Southport, really. That was in 1986, so a long time ago. I've looked after the same population for a very long time. Sadly, somehow medicine, it didn't deliver what I originally really hoped for. So when I got into my early 50s, and I think this happens to so many family doctors, I wasn't quite sure why, but I was disappointed in myself. I didn't feel that I was making a difference. And in fact, the health of the population I cared for was getting worse, not getting better. So that felt really somehow wrong. And I remember one of the things that really got to me was the repeat prescribing of the patients. All of those, I would spend about an hour and a half a day churning out repeat prescriptions for the medications that my patients were on. Sort of a mindless task. And part of me felt, can this be right? Because people don't look much better, and yet it's my job to prescribe for them. So I was disappointed, to the point where, most of my friends are retired in the UK. The commonest age to retire is 55. So I'm 66 now, and I'm the oldest working family doctor for miles around. But aged 55, all of this together contributed to me thinking it was about time to leave. I was disappointed in myself. I thought I would retire and do something for nature. So that was the slow point where a sort of background of, is it time? A bit disappointed. Is it time to shuffle off and do something else? But then I felt a bit beaten. Yeah, beaten, that's the right word. Something wasn't right. I didn't really know what it was. And then the next bit really is 2 women, I would say. One was the Epiphany Day, which was in 2012. In the British NHS, in the National Health Service, we're paid in part depending on prescribing medication for people with type 2 diabetes. And I knew that one of my patients was not cashing in her checks for the metformin, which is the commonest drug we use for diabetes. And she hadn't been using those prescriptions for months. So really the usual thing we did with this was call the patient in and sort of tell them off and point out that, they're shroud wave to say that what you're doing is dangerous, and I'm worried about you, and please take your medication. So I wrote to her saying, I noticed you not taking the metformin. I wonder if we could have a chat, and here's an appointment for you to come and meet me, and we can talk it through. Nothing had prepared me for what was going to happen. She was actually this lady, a wonderful lady who I'd known for years. The first point was she was totally unrecognizable. And that was because she used to be a very large lady and she came in as a very small lady. She'd lost a lot of weight and was dressed totally differently. She was very smartly dressed. And so I mistook her and I didn't know who she was. And so that got us off to a terrible start. And so I tried to show her out of the room and say, well, I think there's been a mistake because I'm expecting Mrs. Jones. And she said, I am Mrs. Jones. And what's more, I've come to complain. I've got a bone to pick with you, which is how we say I'm annoyed. She knew full well that I was going to tell her off. And she said, before you start, I've got some news for you. Her point was that she'd gone against the guidelines. She'd cut not just sugar, but starchy carbohydrates, which meant, given that starchy carbohydrates digest down into sugar, that meant her blood sugar was greatly improved. And she knew this because she was monitoring her own blood sugars. So she stopped the metformin, she stopped eating food that put her blood sugar up, and she felt fabulous. Her blood pressure improved, she felt good, she wasn't on the drugs, she looked good. And her point of anger was she really couldn't understand why, in 10 years as her doctor, I had never once explained to her that bread and potatoes and breakfast cereals and rice all digest down into surprising amounts of sugar. Because she said if she had known that earlier, she said, I've been taking metformin for 10 years quite unnecessarily, because if I'd known that, I would have done it differently, and you never gave me a chance. And then the worrying thing is she said, I even wonder whether you're properly qualified, Dr. Unwin, because this is schoolboy biology, starch and sugar. It's schoolboy biology, and I know it. And why did you never mention this? I was scared, and doubly scared, because every word she said was true. I knew it, of course. We all learn, don't we? The starch molecule is glucose molecules holding hands. I knew that. I knew about digestion, but I had never joined it up. Isn't that shocking? Absolutely shocking. And I was also humbled when she explained to me, she said, that metformin, the side effect was diarrhea, which was so embarrassing for me. But I never told you because it was embarrassing, and I felt I had to just suffer the diarrhea and take the medication. So tragic, really. So then very disappointed, and I knew I had to learn, and learned fast. One of the most important things about angry patients is to know when to shut up and listen, because you will get a complaint if they don't feel understood. And I owed that woman, at least I listened and accepted the point I had something to learn. And what I learned was sad, really, because she was one of about 40,000 people on the low-carb website, and they were teaching each other how to cut the carbs and improve their diabetic control. And when I went online to learn myself, I was horrified how many healthcare professionals were ridiculing their earnest efforts to have better health. So shocking. They were being told that what they did was dangerous. I was really ashamed of colleagues who could treat their earnest efforts to improve their health in this way. And at that point, I thought, well, I'll see what I can do for this community. And for those of you who are paying attention, I did say 2 women, didn't I? The second woman is my amazing wife, Jen. She's a consultant psychologist, very clever woman. To be truthful, she was also a bit disappointed in me, in that she felt I was quitting a bit easily, and that she said, well, why don't you finish on a high note? Why couldn't you finish your career doing something you really believe in? Let's do this low carb thing for people with type 2 diabetes. The sad truth is the reason at that point I wasn't doing it was the other doctors in the practice. There are 8 other doctors, and the nurses didn't agree with what I was doing. They, at that time, felt that it was an odd approach to diabetes, can you believe? Anyway, Jen triumphed because she said, well, what's the objection? Why can't we do it? And I explained, well, the health service isn't paying us for this. So the partners aren't happy for us to do something we're not paid for. And so she said, well, that's simple. Let's do it for free. Why shouldn't we do some good in the world? And I remember her asking, how many cars do we have? And the answer is 2 or 3, which is more than we need. So she said, what are you talking about money for? We should be doing this. So Jen came up with the idea that we would use the facilities of the practice. In the evening, when the surgery isn't running, we could use the waiting rooms and do group consultations for anybody that's interested. And that's what we did. So we started on a Monday night working for free. And what was wonderful is one of the nurses joined us because she wanted to believe in her work. She also was disappointed. Her name was Heather. And she worked for free as well. So Jen did, I did, and Heather did. And then what was wonderful was the results we got. I had never seen anything like it. And I expect, Charles, the same has been for you. When you first see the blood work coming in, you cannot believe the improvements you're seeing in diabetic control, but also fasting lipids and liver function and blood pressure. And I kept all these results, which later on was the basis for many publications. We've done over 20 peer-reviewed publications now. But more immediately, it convinced the partners that what I did was really important. And they were starting to refer patients to me even then. But now they've all become experts in this. And the entire partnership use low carb for many things, and all three nurses do. The practice manager is low carb, most of the staff are. So it has absolutely changed our practice. We really believe now in lifestyle medicine in its many forms.
That's absolutely remarkable. That's quite some epiphany, I will point out. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. I will also point out that 66 is a very fine age to be. And I won't disclose why I say that, but I think it's a good age. I'll also say that your story, I'm sure many family physicians will find echoes in their own careers in what you've said, the disillusionment and the fact that we didn't always get it right. We made mistakes, and sometimes the advice we gave with the best of intentions was not necessarily the best advice. So I know in the past with my own teaching, I mean, we were told about the role of diet and exercise, but it's almost like we were encouraged to gravitate to medications in treating type 2 diabetes. I remember being told how one could pile these on, one on top of the next, because it's all additive. And often this would end up with insulin, sometimes in fairly big doses of insulin. And it seems that really, if we look at the evidence now, we've learnt a lot since then. We kind of can fine-tune the dietary advice and know how important it is now, which is an advance, certainly on when you and I were medical students. So just very briefly, what is the kernel, the nuts and bolts of the dietary changes that you're recommending to your patients?
Yeah, before I get to that, Charles, I'd just like to, I think there's something fundamental has happened about our beliefs to do with diabetes. And that fundamental thing is that you and I were trained with the idea that type 2 diabetes was a chronic, deteriorating, progressive condition. And I remember explaining to patients that unfortunately, we will have to add in more drugs as time goes on in order to maintain control. And that's very, very depressing. What's really great now is, I think it's the work really, a lot of it is Professor Roy Taylor in Newcastle University, who's really proven that drug-free type 2 diabetes remission is quite possible. And now, of course, I've achieved this happy state for 145 of my patients. It's a different paradigm where we are thinking not about drugs, but about the actual cause of the patient's problems. My default before was, what drug shall I give you for this condition? We sort of nodded, didn't we, in the direction of exercise and diet, but we didn't really believe it. We sort of said, yes, I'll refer you to the dietitian. But we felt that the important thing was the drugs and that we did the important stuff. And now it's so different because I always have a sense of failure if I use drugs. I do, of course, prescribe drugs regularly for my patients, but I do so with a slight sense of failure and a slight sense of regret that perhaps I wonder if I could have managed to avoid that. And then secondly, I think you were asking me sort of what's the basis of the approach. Well, I mentioned it already. The basis of my approach now is to do with curiosity. And that curiosity is, why is my patient unwell? What is the true cause? And this was another problem for me. A lack of curiosity. I used to see myself as a scientist, and that, well, if you're a scientist, you should be interested in the cause of illness. And yet I never thought about why do people develop type 2 diabetes? And this is a really important question, because in our own practice, when I was a young man, I did an audit in the very first month of when I joined Norwood Avenue Surgery in 1986. And there were 57 people with type 2 diabetes. then. In the same population now, we've got over 600. So we have a 10-fold increase in the prevalence of a very serious disease that kills people. And so I think we have a moral duty to be curious as to what has happened to people. Because if you're not sure why people are ill, how can you be certain about the treatment you suggest? This isn't how I was thinking when I was 55 at all, but it is how I think now, because I don't want to make the same mistake twice. You know, a sensitivity to physiology, a sensitivity to why are people ill. It is reassuring when you're going to suggest a treatment. So going back to diabetes, I've talked about metformin. Well, yes, I prescribe metformin, but you don't suffer with type 2 diabetes because your metformin gland has stopped functioning. It's not metformin replacement that we're doing. It's not like HRT, you know. The problem is that your insulin isn't working as well. The problem is insulin resistance, where your insulin isn't working. And that means that carbohydrates, sugar and starchy carbs, in a way, they become a poison because you can't regulate the blood sugar easily. And I would say that the lucky thing is that we are a dual fuel engine. There are two fuels that we can burn. One is, of course, sugar, but the other one is fat. And actually, you know, Charles, I have type 2 diabetes. It's not a thing I talk about very often. I do actually have it. And so I know this from the patient perspective. And I can burn fat, and I do. So the whole point is, can we help people eat nutritious, nutrient-dense food that doesn't put their blood sugar up? And the point is, yes, you can, because I've done it for 12 years, and I'm now a fat burner. So I've reduced the carbohydrates very significantly. I've increased protein and fat, and I've never been healthier. So I can run. I can race with my grandchildren. I can run 3 miles, and I'm 66, so that's a great achievement. The basis of it is avoiding foods that put your blood sugar up. And that's how I start with patients. I say, do you know the foods that put your blood sugar up? So there's two main points. One is hope. The good news for people is you could improve your health. Maybe in just a few months' time, your health could be the best it's been for years. That's the first thing, hope. And the second thing is the nitty-gritty, the detail of how to help my patients make better dietary choices.
Well, that's wonderful. It's music to my ears, personally. But I'm so happy you mentioned insulin resistance, because my understanding is that, I mean, it's the main problem with the majority of our patients with type 2 diabetes, but it's also implicated in things like mental health challenges, or even, some say, the development of Alzheimer's disease. In what you're doing, do you track are patients reporting better mood, more energy, less brain fog, anything like that when they are, I mean, you're not giving it to them for that reason. You're advising the diet changes to try and put their diabetes into remission. But do you get these sort of bonus effects?
Charles, all of the above on a daily basis. This is the joy that keeps me going, the wonderful surprises. Let's just go a little bit into the physiology before I add a bit of flesh to that. So the fact you become insulin resistant means that because of homeostasis, you tend to become hyperinsulinemic. So your body is trying to compensate so that you are both insulin resistant and hyperinsulinemic. And it's those two things that lead to a great many problems. The first thing I saw very often was a reduction in anxiety. People were less anxious, less fretty, more confident. And at the beginning, I thought it was just because, well, they maybe look so much better or whatever. And then patients would say, well, it's a weird thing. If I cheat, if I have sugar, like the depression and anxiety comes back. And I actually had a personal experience of this that really nailed it home. So I noticed that my mood was a lot better, my own mood. Also, I needed less sleep, about an hour a day's less sleep when I was first low carb. I became less fretty. I worried less. So Jen said I used to be quite a fretty senior partner. And then she noticed I was coping with mainstream media. I was on TV. None of which was a problem suddenly. Then we had a very significant wedding anniversary, and the chef made a very special lemon pudding, and I scoffed a lot. The anxiety that produced, that sugar. When I first ate it, I got like a sugar high, like little sparklers going off in my brain. Felt fat. Yeah, I thought this is amazing, totally amazing. But then from that point on, profound depression for 2 days and anxiety. And we were in a hotel and it totally ruined it. And that's happened a few times where I've cheated. And of course, now all of this is being researched, and you may usefully have Dr. Ian Campbell or the wonderful psychiatrist, Dr. Georgia Reed, who's now a friend of mine. There is now a massive movement of nutritional psychiatry. They're doing the same for psychiatry as I have done with diabetes, which is, well, why are our patients? Where is this pandemic of mental ill health coming from? And yes, I've been able to take people off antidepressants. I've had some amazing results. Patients who, with major problems of obesity, mental health, really complicated heart sink patients who become heroes. I've got one boy in, Charles, in Canada, are you stones or pounds or kilos?
Kilograms, probably, yeah.
Kilos, okay. Well, I've got one boy who's easily lost now 100 kilos in weight. And when he first came to us, we couldn't even weigh him. And I have a few like that. And they have a lot of problems that come with that kind of weight, very heavy. People over 150 kilos probably have sleep apnea. Almost certainly have backache, ankle ache, low self-esteem. They have erectile dysfunction. They have lots of problems. But if you can stick with it, some of them can become transformed. One of the little tricks I would say to practitioners, they probably wonder, well, how does this happen? One of the things I do with patients, I say, when you come, I say, maybe what if today was the heaviest day that you'd ever be? Maybe what if from today you were going to get smaller? How about maybe you take a very private photo of yourself as you are today, and the only thing you owe me, if our work together is a success, is that photo as a before and then an after. And I've now got a great many of these before and afters. And those are the things that mainstream media love. So another thing people wonder is how on earth. So I've written for the Daily Mail. I've probably done 35 big pieces for the Daily Mail, the Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Express. I don't think there's a single paper I haven't written for. What they want visually impactful stuff and stories of hope. Visually, some of what my patients achieve. You can't not believe it when you see it. I expect, Charles, you've had experiences like this, people transformed, and it's intoxicating, and I never tire of it. I absolutely never tire of it. And I'm excited by the possibility of each of us has a range of futures ahead of us. So another point is the possibilities is which future will you choose? I can see a future where you're fitter, breathe better, you look fabulous. There are other futures too, though. And in some of those other futures can be some very challenging, sad stuff. Let's go to the light. Let's move to the light. Let's choose hope.
Let's choose hope. What a lovely expression. Absolutely. So from what you're saying, it's about insulin resistance, and we get all these other wonderful benefits when we go with low carb and try to burn fat and lose our weight and all those things. That's fantastic. But my other impression is that we've got type 2 diabetes, where we have elevated hemoglobin A1C, elevated fasting glucose. And then we got a condition we call pre-diabetes, which is sort of going up a little bit, but it's not quite there. But it seems there's a phase which can be even a few years before that, where we have insulin resistance, but we're still compensating enough that those numbers are not rising yet. So can I just ask, are you trying to identify insulin resistance at that phase before it translates into raised HbA1c or fasting glucose? Because isn't there more of an opportunity to get people on the right track then, before they even become diabetic? So we don't even have to talk about remission. We have to really talk about prevention.
Music to my ears. Absolutely, Charles. The answer cannot be to wait until our nations are sick. The health services everywhere are struggling with the demand. And so prevention and I know it's a lot easier. And in fact, I've got the data on that. If at Norwood Avenue in my practice, you come to me with pre-diabetes, 93% of all the people that I find with pre-diabetes can expect to have a normal blood sugar and all of the other improvements that come with the approach within 3 months. And we've published that in BMJ Nutrition, 93%. If you wait, so you're right, I mean, there's about 10 years while this is a hidden problem. So if you wait until you're no longer compensating your insulin resistance and your blood sugar runs out of control, then you have type 2 diabetes. With the new development of type 2 diabetes, at that point, at NOAD Avenue, there's a 73% chance I will get remission for you. So it's dropped from 93 to 73%. Well, then what if you wait another 5 years? People who've had diabetes for 5 years, then I'm down to about 50%. And so there are some really good reasons it's harder. And again, we wrote all of this up in the 2023 paper in BMJ Nutrition. So there's an idea really of not chronological age. So the oldest person I've got remission of diabetes in is 91 years old. For that lady, it mattered because she was in her own home doing gardening. So for me, it's the metabolic age, not the chronological age. And equally, I've got people in their 20s with diabetes. So the earlier you start in the metabolic age, the better. And in particular, there's some wonderful work, again, of Professor Roy Taylor, who talks about the long silent screen from the liver. Part of insulin resistance is a result of fatty liver disease, because as you continue to eat carbohydrate is turned into triglyceride, deposited in the liver, and that is how fatty liver develops. And fatty liver interferes with the good work of insulin and is at least 50% of how it is that your insulin doesn't work as well. And the tragic figure here is that 38% of the entire world now has fatty liver disease. I mean, I knew this really in practice, because when you do ultrasounds, they're always being reported as fatty liver. And when you do liver function, and when you do fasting triglyceride levels, I've audited them now, and at least a third of all my patients have abnormal results. But the thing was, before I didn't know what to do about it, so I sort of hushed it up or said, well, you need to lose a bit of weight, or maybe exercise a bit more, or we'll maybe do the blood test again in a year and push the problem along the road a bit. Now I meet it head on, because I'm honest with the patients and I'm saying, listen, it's much easier to sort this now, particularly when you're seeing people with a combination. So if their waist is beginning, if your belly's beginning to get bigger, if your blood pressure's going up, if triglycerides are rising, if liver function is beginning to go off, all of these are early warning signs and they shouldn't be ignored. And it's to my regret that I did ignore that. And it's such an opportunity for wonderful work and easy work too, and you repaid many times over because their health improves early and easily.
Yeah, you've mentioned your 2023 paper, which I think of all the papers you've published, maybe for me that's the most seminal one. I think it's the one that was entitled "What Predicts Drug-Free Remission from Type 2 Diabetes," and we can certainly put a link on our screen to that paper for anyone that's interested. I'll also mention that we're hoping to interview Dr. Edie and Dr. Campbell on future episodes of this podcast series. But what I'd also like to ask you about, because I know as family physicians, we've got good intentions, we know what we need to be doing, but we struggle to get things done in the 10 to 15 minutes allotted to us per patient. And we sometimes get frustrated because we know we haven't done a good job with that. And I understand that you and your wife, Jen, who, as you've said, is a clinical psychologist, have developed a kind of behavioral tool for family docs. And I believe it's called GRIN, which is an acronym, but it obviously evokes happy thoughts, GRIN. Can you tell us a little bit about GRIN and how and why it works?
Yeah, so this is Jen's work. Previously, we were both trying to use CBT, and that, let me tell you, in a 10-minute appointment is something of a challenge, and it's complicated. Jen became very interested about what part of CBT was the effective part. What were the really important bits of cognitive behavioral therapy? And she wasn't the only psychologist interested in this. There was a bunch of them working on it. And it ended up, that morphed into brief solution-focused therapy. And then Jen spent 2 years distilling it down. So we wanted something that you could teach nurses or coaches or doctors very, very quickly, because of course so much of medicine is about behavior change. And we're not really taught much about behavior change. And yet it's key to successful work as a family doctor, whether it's smoking, drinking, exercise, all sorts of behaviors could be changed for the better. And so the GRIN model is published, and if you Google GRIN and Unwin, you will find our paper, which is open access. All our papers are open access. So we don't want to make money out of anything. There's no copyright, steal anything we do. But I'll give it you now in a very quick way. GRIN obviously stands for something. GRIN. Begins with G, and that's goals. These are to do with patients' health goals. So what are they, if things go really well, what are they hoping for? Maybe they're hoping for drug-free diabetes remission. Maybe they're hoping to breathe better. Maybe they're hoping to be able to run like me with my grandchildren. All sorts of things, particularly weight loss. Don't accept weight loss as a goal. Ask, what difference would this make to you? And listen, because you hear some wonderful stories if you ask patients. So that's G for goals, your patients' goals. Because if you can develop shared goals with patients, it's the most wonderful medicine. I bet, Charles, you've already done that many times over. Shared goals just feels so great, and it's safe, and you're working together. 2 and 2 are 5 with shared goals. But you can't have shared goals if you've not rummaged around and found out what your patients are hoping. The next one is R. Again, the old Dr. Unwin tended to believe that patients were blank slates waiting for my genius to impart itself. That's funny, isn't it? How arrogant. No, of course, patients are resilient, patients are intelligent, and they have relevant experience. So resilience and relevant experience are ours. Have you lost weight before? How did you do it? What resources do you have that may be useful to this? Maybe somebody else wants to lose weight in the family. Would they join you? All sorts of questions like that. And then you're not alone, because they're starting to think about how they do it. So why would they do it? First, the goals, and then how will they do it with the resources? And then I stands for increments. So many of us have a huge goal, and maybe that huge goal, I don't know, could be to lose 100 kilos. But increments is the first step that you and the patient agree on that day. So you've told me about your goals. We've discussed the resources you think might be useful. What do you think you're going to do before you see me next? What can we shake on today? And they might say, right, I'm going to give up biscuits or sugar in tea and coffee or all sorts of things. Or they'll buy a low-carb book, or they'll go online, or whatever. Anyway, increments. So that's GRI. And then the N is very powerful, and that's noticing. Noticing what makes a difference. So much of medicine, as I used to practice it, was noticing negative things, noticing pain, noticing depression, noticing failure. But how about we flip that and start noticing success and how it feels and what works? What you do then is it flips your medicine into something far more cheerful, because patients know I'm really interested in what works. And they tell me about their successes. And that forms the beginning of the next consultation. So when they walk in, I'm saying, have you noticed anything that's improved? How are you doing? Have you noticed anything that's improved? And then they tell me about their skin condition, or they sleep better, loads and loads of things. And that we've just spelled GRIN. If anybody wants to know more about GRIN, please read our paper, open access on Google. And I hope that was of interest.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. So the value of positive feedback, a clear message. You've also used, earlier on, you used the words continuity of care and how important that is to you. I think here in British Columbia, we use the term longitudinal care. It's the same thing, but it really seems to me to be the essence of what we do as family docs, the notion of longitudinal care. But I think that also means we become very aware when our patients are not doing well, because we know when they are doing well what they are like. And, life throws curveballs. I guess curveball is a North American term, but, we get surprises and things go wrong in our lives, and we're stressed at times, and it's almost natural or inevitable that at times we relapse or we feel we've failed. And so I'm just interested to know, in what the work that you're doing, I'm sure there must be times when you see someone who has that relapse, and how to help them through that. And hopefully, because I guess the other thing is the changes they're making, if they fall off the wagon, the type 2 diabetes comes back. So that's not a cure, but remission is an ongoing process. But how do you help them through the relapses?
Thank you. That's a lovely question, Charles. And it's really important because very few patients, medium to long term, don't have a period of failure. The important thing is not to think of it as failure. So this little bit of the chat is about reframing failure. And it's so important to do that. The time of year that I face the biggest challenge is, of course, after Christmas. I have to work so hard because so many people, the society is conspiring against us to put our blood sugar up. And I'm rescuing people in large numbers throughout January and February. So I think the first thing is to avoid guilt. It's the most useless emotion. Today is the beginning of the rest of your life. And so the point about the Christmas that's just gone is what we can learn from it. So I would say to a patient is, this past Christmas in terms of your health hasn't been great. What could we learn from that? What would you do differently next Christmas? At what point could you have done something different? And then I want it to be specific. The same applies to another common failure. Things like, those all-inclusive cheap holidays. That's another one. And what would you do differently? Would you book a different type of holiday somewhere else? Would you talk to your family in advance? Lots of things. So I try and use the intelligence that my patients have to help them plan and do it differently next time. And I think so many of us, this is, my medicine didn't go that well until I was 55. And so we can all learn from mistakes. And the trick is, don't be guilty. Be open to doing it differently, and then monitor what you do. And then what's the feedback, and find out how you do it. Hardly anybody just loses weight and never needs to learn another thing, particularly because of the addictive nature of refined carbohydrates, which is really the life work of my wife, where the definition of addiction is when you do something that you know will harm your health and you do it again and again. And people eat biscuits when they know it'll put their blood sugar up and it'll harm their health, just as they reach for cigarettes and alcohol. And so these mistakes are going to happen. I used to call it carb creep, but I don't think that belittles something which is far more sinister. It isn't carb creep. For many people, it's carb addiction. And really, we need to be thinking about abstinence if you are a carb addict. Abstinence is the only thing that will work. And you can learn from your mistakes. If it keeps happening, do something different. So that's what I feel about that. Avoid the guilt, but see it as a learning opportunity and do work through it, often with maybe somebody else.
Right. That's very inspiring. I'm just interested to know what in your patient group, when you have someone that you think is now going to be suitable for this kind of intervention, what sort of uptake do you have from patients? Do you have anyone who says to you, "Sure, doc, I get it. I know what you're telling me, but it sounds like an awful lot of work, and I've watched the TV and I've seen this advert for this injection I can give myself once a week, and I'm going to lose all my weight and I'm going to get rid of my diabetes. That sounds a lot easier." Do you get any people that tell you that, or do you have really good uptake?
We have good uptake despite that. So let's just talk about the figures in our practice. So we've, as I say, it's about 10,000 patients perhaps now in the practice. The people with diabetes, about 22% of them are now in remission of the whole practice. And this is an NHS practice, so I can't pick patients, until I die or they die, they're my patients. So that's how it goes. So we've got about 20% in remission. We've got just over half of everybody with diabetes is probably low carb. So that leaves another half who are maybe lower carb or not low carb at all. The number of people who actually are not interested is very small, and they're mainly carb addicts. So I remember one lady who said, "Well, I'm just addicted to chocolate. I know that's really serious, and I know I'll probably end up in a wheelchair." And she did, actually. And that was very sad, but it's really rare. If I give people hope and I'm pointing out, you could lose weight, you could feel so much better. Shall we try? And I'll support you. I'd be interested in that. It's really rare to be turned down. We are occasionally, but the ones who really struggle are the carb addicts, and they're the ones that I'm using the injections in. But I'm setting it up as maybe this will help you temporarily. I think we need to be honest with patients and say the worry is we have no idea what happens long term to people who use these drugs. And I'm not sure that's very responsible medicine to use things, on younger people when you have no idea what will happen to them. And I've already had one in intensive care. The gastrointestinal tract just packed up, and that poor woman is still in intensive care. And they're taking out parts of her bowel because it just stopped working. These things, they can go wrong. And the drugs I think the place of drugs is you need to weigh up the pros and cons honestly. There are always side effects and there may be benefits. Let's weigh them up. And the honesty is the weight loss, the Wegovy, this sort of thing. We do know that if you stop the injections, the weight comes back. But therefore, you're trapped. But what if it stops working? Do we even know? For me, I did a paper with a professor years ago now, about 2015, and we looked at the terrible history of weight loss drugs over the last 50 years, and it's littered with miracle drugs that are going to change the world, but then you find there are heart problems or psychiatric problems or whatever. So I hope Wegovy turns out to be useful, but it's very rare that we find a treatment that has no downside. So yes, I use it very carefully, and I'm really worried about young people. And of course, how does it work? It helps you eat less. How does bariatric surgery work? It helps you eat less. It's all about eating less. It's all about hunger and eating less. And carbs make you hungry. The more biscuits you have, the hungrier you will become. So sometimes I negotiate with patients to say, well, you'd be on the waiting list for bariatric surgery for a year. How about we have a go at this before then? And I've got a very happy few patients who never needed the bariatric surgery or the surgery for sleep apnea because we sorted it out before then. But again, the long term, the continuity of care, Charles, really helps because our patients trust us. We're very vulnerable to the drug companies if it's all anonymous, if it's just a locum, somebody passing through, because they struggle to say no to their patients. Whereas I can say maybe, and let's just talk about the pros and the cons. And they, on the whole, know that I'm trying my best and they trust me and I can explain why, and I'm prepared to explain why. That's the new Dr. Unwin. I'm really happy to explain why, because if I can't explain why, then maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. I used to get very annoyed with Dr. Google, those patients used to look things up and I used to get all hoity-toity about it and say, well, I have an actual medical qualification, very pompous. But somebody who's looking things up on Google is beginning to think, and that's to be encouraged. If people can take an interest in their health and some responsibility, that sort of thing to celebrate, not to crush. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's really wise wisdom, sage advice. I guess medications do have a place, but the way we've been taught is just piling them on was, if I look back on my career, everything done with good intentions, but accept that errors were made. And another area where I listened to what I was taught and what I was told to do, I used to say to my patients with type 2 diabetes, don't worry, don't sweat the small stuff. Don't worry about your getting a glucose monitor. I'll just do your HbA1c every 3 months and I'll tell you how it's going. You can trust me, that's fine. And I was actually taught to do that. I think technology has helped us. We've come a long way since then. I honestly am not sure that was good advice I was giving. My patients might have been happy because they didn't have to focus too much on numbers or anything. But just before we wrap up, can you please just let me know your thoughts on what we call continuous glucose monitoring? I know in the UK you use the term Freestyle Libre, which is probably a trade name. But what is the role of that? How important is that?
Well, of course, Charles, we're coming back, aren't we, to psychology? And Jen would teach us is the sooner the feedback comes on the behavior, the faster you will learn. And so the hemoglobin A1C is the average sugariness of your blood in the previous 3 months. Well, I can't remember what I ate 2 months ago, and I'm not sure I care. And so what have you learned from the hemoglobin A1C? Just a very general, it's bad news. But of course, continuous glucose monitoring is amazing because then you're really pinpointing where is that sugar coming from. And that's what I'm doing in all the clinics, really. The patients and I We're searching for the sugar. Where is it coming from? Because many people don't realize that a glass of milk will put up your blood sugar. All sorts of foods like sweet corn might, do, or barbecue sauce, or all sorts of things. And so I absolutely love glucose monitors. But just like you, it was frowned upon because of the cost of the sticks in the health service. So I was supposed to be dissuading people from being interested in their blood sugar, and it was really frowned upon. And we were wrong. The problem at the moment is the continuous glucose monitors are only available in the British Health Service to people, type 2 diabetics, who are on insulin. Anyway, I'm breaking the rules every day. I'm doing a very naughty thing. I'm prescribing continuous glucose monitors for people with type 2 diabetes, because even so, I'm still saving, as you said, huge amounts of money on the drug budget. So who's going to put me in jail? Because I believe, isn't it a moral thing to help our patients learn about what they're doing? So what I say to patients is, right, download the Freestyle Libre app on your phone, because then I don't have to get you a reader. And I prescribe for them just a month's worth, which is 2. And then I see them and we learn from there. And then many of them buy others if they can, but at least they get 2. And you learn some astonishing things. One guy was on insulin, and the only reason he needed insulin was because he ate buckets of cornflakes. Actually, buckets of them. I had no idea. He took photos. I said, what's that spike his blood sugar was up to? In the 20s, and it was cornflakes. So I think continuous glucose monitors are hope. They're the cavalry coming over the hill to rescue exhausted old doctors like Charles and me. Who can deny now wearing one of these monitors? You see the spike. What did you just do? Well, don't do it again. Eat something else. I can eat tasty, nutritious food, and I do every day, that doesn't put my blood sugar up. And I put it on Twitter, and you can follow me as Low-Carb GP on Twitter. Sometimes we put plates of food that don't put your blood sugar up. And that's the holy grail. And I think the combination, Charles, of continuous glucose monitors, and then the other thing is insurance companies are becoming very seriously interested around the world. So I've been working with a huge reinsurance company called Swiss Re, obviously in Switzerland. They're fascinated by the potential for saving people's lives, and then you don't have to pay out on the insurance. Diabetes is a very expensive disease. Very expensive for the insurance companies. And it may be that could even have cheaper health insurance if you had a Freestyle Libre. So as you say, kind of wrapping it up on a note of hope. So we know about remission. At least 50% of people with diabetes can achieve remission. But the final point of hope that again was in our publication was, what happens to those that don't achieve remission? Well, it was all but about 2% of the entire lot that went low carb got improved control of their blood sugar. So nearly everybody can improve their blood sugar, and that means living better and living longer. And wow, that's really worth it.
Yeah, I think that's very wise, because, when we use the word remission, it almost can be interpreted, well, if you don't get there, you've failed. But if you've managed to cut down your insulin dose by a substantial amount, or you're off 3 out of the 4 of your other medications, I mean, that's a huge success. And I think we just need to remind people of that. It's not, remission is wonderful if you can get there, but it's not the be all and end all. If we set our sights just on that, then we're going to fail more often than we should. But
if you'll allow me, there's one other
yeah.
thing that I just think we haven't talked about type 1 diabetes at all. And of course, it's quite different, and people with type 1 diabetes need insulin. But actually, there is an interesting place for reducing dietary carbohydrates in type 1, because then you don't need no insulin, but less insulin. And of course, the worldwide expert on this is my friend, Dr. Ian Lake, who's also on Twitter. And you might consider, Charles, talking to Ian. He actually has type 1 diabetes. And he has a great deal of wisdom to offer people with type 1 diabetes, a completely different illness.
That's right. And I think there is also a term we used to use, type 1.5 diabetes. And these are actually type 2 diabetic patients with type 2 diabetes that have their pancreas has just given up. They can't produce insulin anymore. So they don't really have the insulin resistance that most patients with type 2 diabetes have, but they're got low insulin, and so they probably need some insulin. So that's almost like a subgroup, and they're almost approaching being like a type 1 diabetic, if I can use that term. So I guess that's also humbling. We know not everyone is the same. Not everybody is going to respond to the treatment for insulin resistance. But what I find so powerful about your story, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that you are afflicted with type 2 diabetes yourself. I had no idea of that, but it's always so powerful when we have stories from people who've been through this and can speak not just from the perspective of, well, do this or do that, but I've been there, I'm involved in this. But just as a final question, the work you've done is so inspiring, but how do we get more family docs, more GPs to practice this kind of medicine? I mean, we can't sprout David Unwins in every country, in every province, even though it would be wonderful. But how do we upscale this? Because do we need to be talking to the health policy folks? I know you've spoken with some very high up people in the UK, but yeah, upscaling seems so important. What you've done in your practice is so inspiring, but how do we encourage family docs to do this all over the place?
It's a really interesting and complex question. We're fighting a battle on many, many fronts, but it's a battle worth fighting. For doctors who want to know a lot more, producing educational material specifically for family doctors is important. And I'm pretty sure your organization is doing that already. For anybody else, the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine has published a 5-hour educational thing that I've done, so that we tried to put all of the psychology, all of the physiology into this module that you can purchase from the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. I think it's very useful for patients who have got good results to try and interest their doctors in how they did it. And I know some of my colleagues are not curious, but you could print one of my papers. It's open access. So, if you've done something low carb and the results are good, and your doctor isn't sure what you've done, it's reassuring for doctors to see that papers have been published in reputable journals that mimic this, that you're doing something that doctors all over the world are doing. And so you can print off one of my papers and take it in to a doctor to say, well, this guy, I am actually a Royal College of General Practitioners clinical expert in diabetes. So the Royal College have recognized my work as being respectable. And that can help. For those doctors that are doing it, one thing you can do is collect data. I'm encouraging doctors to audit what they do. And in Europe, actually, you don't need ethics approval to publish audit of clinical work. It's respectable to audit your work, get the baseline data and latest follow-up. It can be very simple. Baseline hemoglobin A1C and baseline weight and latest follow-up. And you can publish that. And gradually, all over the world, GPs and doctors are publishing their work. And the number of publications on low carb is going up astronomically. And this is changing the way that low carb is viewed. And then you've got my idea about, either as individuals or for doctors, the idea of photos of you at your heaviest and latest and put it on Twitter. People love that kind of thing. I think that's probably enough. There are low carb. We did a low carb program. The question was, well, is it just Dr. Unwin magic? So we wrote a low carb program that was done by 460,000 people that got, and that takes me out of it altogether. And that was just a downloadable program that got very good results. And that is also being replicated all over the world, where people are buying programs or signing up. My last idea is, I don't know, Charles, in Canada, can you get the Freshwell app, the free Freshwell app? I'm pretty sure you can.
I haven't heard of that. I haven't heard of it, but could be.
Yeah. So a friend of mine took my work, which was about working out how sugary food is, and developed a wonderful app, which is approved within the British National Health Service, and it's free. And I think 100,000 people have had that. And it's called the Freshwell app, and it'll cost you nothing. And it is available internationally and very, very useful. So that's another idea. And then the final idea, Charles, is put in a link to some of my teaspoon of sugar equivalents, so people can see that a bowl of rice is about the same as 10 teaspoons of sugar, or a banana is 7 teaspoons of sugar, those type of things, because they help people make better choices, better dietary choices. I think you've probably heard enough now.
No, that is so simple, but this whole idea of the teaspoon of sugar, I know that you and Jen have done something on that, and it makes it so easily accessible. It's a graphic that you just Okay, now I get it. It's
Yeah.
not just sugar that contains sugar. These other things also all
Yes,
contain
it's all
sugar.
these other, so there are all these infographics, they've been downloaded millions of times,
Yeah.
and they've now been translated into 38 languages. And other translations are happening, and they are very simple ways. And there are charts. So again, if you Google, the quick way to that is Google Unwin and PHC, which is a charity I helped set up, and sugar, and the teaspoon of sugar infographics are there. There are 7 of them. And as I say, in 35 languages or so. In particular, I'm sure French is there, which is what you need in Canada.
We'll put the link to those infographics onto our screen for listeners. But David, thank you. It's just been so inspiring listening to your insights and your wisdom and learning about all your achievements, all your programs. As a fellow family doc, I can just applaud your courage and your dedication. It's remarkable. But I think above all, I'm happy that you have found such happiness and fulfillment in your career. I know you've described this as happy medicine because it is just so fulfilling, and it really gets back to why we became doctors in the beginning. It's wonderful to see someone who feels fulfilled in their medical career. So I just wish you all the best. Maybe we can host you again one day on this podcast series. It would be our pleasure, certainly. But thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I also want to thank our producer, Anne Mullins, and Graham Wheeler, who's our technical whiz. And of course, thank you to IPTN for sponsoring this podcast series. IPTN also sponsors the websites diabetesremission.ca and versingprediabetes.ca. We'll put the links to those up as well. So once again, I'm Dr. Charles Helm. You've been listening to At the Helm, and I have been interviewing Dr. David Unwin today. Really hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and I hope I can look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.